The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Vegetables.
Eat your vegetables, they're good for you. How often have you heard that? Of course it's true. Fresh, frozen or tinned, we eat millions of tons, but they've all got to be grown somewhere. That's what market gardening is all about. It's a very demanding area of food production, highly intensive and expensive in order to produce yields of vegetables which look good, feel good and taste good. Richard Beach is a vegetable grower.
Vegetables are very expensive to grow these days. For a start, we use hybrid seed that costs many pounds per acre. This gives us a very uniform vegetable. When one sort of thinks about cauliflowers and cabbages that one sees in the shops, they're all of very high standard, the same sort of size. Another big expense we have is controlling the weeds in all the different vegetable crops. This is all done chemically, because if we had to do it by hand, it would be even more expensive. The standards are very high. Many of the vegetables are sold through the multiple chains, and the demand is for ever higher standards.
So it's an industry which is highly sophisticated in its techniques, its harvesting and in the final packaging for the consumer, and by the nature of vegetables themselves, one which needs ideal conditions.
The weather is the big factor with the conditions. The water that the crop has, whether it's naturally from rain or from irrigation, makes the complete difference to the result of your vegetable crop. An example is cauliflower suffers stress almost immediately if it hasn't had the correct amount of rain or irrigation. In one day you can lose your crop if the temperature is high. Another example where it matters much less is with asparagus. That can be grown in Spain in conditions that are much hotter than us and much less water, but it's basically deep-rooted and doesn't suffer to the same extent.
And with perfect conditions, vegetable production in Britain is an important industry. 500,000 acres outdoors and 10,000 under glass or plastic, producing about £750 million worth each year.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Fruit farming.
What do pippins and pearmains have in common? Well, they're two kinds of English apple out of many varieties for eating, cooking and cider making. In fact, about 130,000 acres are used for apple production in the United Kingdom. Hard fruit growing involves high investment in the trees, bushes or plants, on protection from pests and on labour for picking and packing. It's an area of farming ripe for new ideas, as fruit grower Richard Beach explains.
In the trade we say top fruit growing rather than hard fruit growing. In the production of apples, great steps have been made over the last few years. It used to take us 7 or 8 years to get an apple orchard into production after planting. Now, by investing much more capital, we are able, with all the new techniques that the research stations have found for us, to get our apples into production after about 3 years to an economic return on our investment. This work is also being looked at by 1 or 2 of our research stations, and we're hoping we'll be able to do the same things with plums, because there is quite a big interest in Victoria plums.
But what of soft fruit? So popular have strawberries and raspberries become that whole fields are devoted to them, often with pick-your-own signs. But soft fruit growing is a risky business.
The worries start, as with most fruits, at in the late spring, when the different fruits are out in flower. We always go through a period when we're worrying whether we're going to get much frost damage. And then we come to the picking. It's the old weather again that we're worried about. On our soft fruit farm, which we have for pick your own, The weather makes a tremendous difference there because people don't want to come to the farm if it's raining. And then there is also the problem of the strawberries going rotten. This is botrytis on the strawberries, and that is a major problem in a wet, humid time.
And if the cost or the weather doesn't ruin the fruit farmer, perhaps the customer will. We're quite choosy about how we like our fruit. It's a job sometimes for the grower to meet our fashionable new demands.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, where produce goes.
The average person in Britain gets through about £7 weight of food per week, and over a year 65% is cooked or processed before we buy it in the shops. We only get 35% of our food direct from the supplier. Most farm produce has many uses and goes through a processing system of one kind or another, often several stages between the farmer and us. Take that new yellow crop we see nowadays, a field of rape. What happens to that? Alex Park.
It's a very interesting crop, rape. It's fairly changed the look of our countryside with patches of yellow all over the place. It's grown largely as a break crop between cereals. We cannot grow cereals, wheat, barley, oats every year because the build-up of pests and diseases would soon reduce yields. So every so often we have to grow a different crop like rape or peas or grass. Oilseed rape was grown in France, now grown widely in Britain, and it's used in the oil industry, both for human consumption, for cooking oil, and for specialty lubricants. The oilseed rape is combined on the farm. The seeds go off to the processing plant where they're crushed. The oil is extracted. The residue is then sent to the animal food compounder and goes back into the animal chain. And so it's a very good crop for providing human products and byproducts going back through to our animals.
By contrast, 20% of our diet is meat. Do British farmers satisfy this demand?
We are virtually self-sufficient, but like all products, we export some and we import some. We're great traders in Britain. Probably heard of the exports of lamb to France. The French are deficient in lamb, and so they take our lamb as and when they want it. It's a very complicated matter. We import beef cattle from Ireland. We've always taken in store cattle for finishing in this country. We export meat products to the developing countries, and we import meat products from the developing countries when they have surplus. So it's quite an interesting operation, the meat products. We are able to break down large carcasses in this country, vacuum pack them, and so they can go off in a very easy and convenient way to our markets in the Middle East and in Africa.
And then, of course, there's the business of what happens to the meat which we wouldn't buy, offcuts and such like. Well, it's turned into pet foods, an industry in itself worth £350 million a year.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, markets and marts.
There are about 56 million cattle, sheep and pigs down on the farm in the United Kingdom, and at one stage or another, some of them will pay a visit to the auction market. They'll be there for sale, either as stores, which will be raised or fattened on the buyers' farms, or as fat stock, destined for the table. What goes on at an auction? Alex Park.
Well, everything. It's all hell breaks loose when the market's in full swing. The main feature of the market is the creation of a buying and selling price for various grades of stock on a weekly or a daily basis. Assuming there are plenty buyers and sellers available, the true market price of animals will be determined in the market. You know, not all animals go to a market nowadays for selling. Quite a number are sold privately, but it's the open market which determines the value of the animals between a private buyer and seller. Prices fluctuate very rapidly with cattle particularly, and also with pigs. For instance, in the summer when the weather goes cold, the demand for meat products rises as people turn away from salads. When the weather is very hot, back to salads and the meat price drops, and that's reflected very rapidly in the market.
Animals arrive in cattle trucks or trailers and are put into numbered pens to wait their turn in the sale ring. Interested buyers have a firm idea of how much they think the animals are worth, but it's the auctioneer's job to make sure the best price is reached. He'll get between 1 and 2% of the sale value. But what about farmers and dealers?
Yes, it's a bit of a lottery in the market. If there are a lot of cattle entered, they're balloted so that everybody gets a random choice as to when the animals are sold. Very early in the day there may not be all the buyers there, and so the price can be a bit low. Later on, when everybody's there, the prices can rise, and then as the buyers have become satisfied or have gone off to the bar or for lunch, the prices tend to drop. So it's a bit of a lucky lottery in that sense, but I suppose over a year or over a number of years these things will be evened out, and you'll have good days and bad days, but overall you probably get the market price if the truth was known.
But the local auction is much more than just a sales ring for the farming community. Amongst its noise and bustle, the farmer meets his colleagues and hears the gossip and the news, a good opportunity to keep his finger on the pulse of his business.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. National and county shows.
Agricultural shows are literally the showcases of British farming, and there are 54 principal ones, including 11 royal shows, like the Royal Smithfield in London or the Royal Show in Warwickshire, not to mention the hundreds of small local shows held up and down the country which serve the same purpose. That's for farmers, manufacturers and breeders to show off the best of produce, livestock and machinery. But what is the value to a show winner? Alex Park.
Very important if you're in the business of selling pedigree animals. The agricultural show is the shop window. It's also the hobby. As farmers, we tend to be totally immersed in our farming operations. We get our pleasure from the farms, and we also get our living from the farms. So we take our best animals to the shows, compete with the neighbours on a local level, compete with the country at the national shows, such as the Royal Show held every year at the beginning of July. It's our chance to show off our best cattle to overseas buyers and to British buyers. And if we win, then our animals can be worth many thousands of pounds, or their offspring, or the semen if in the case of a bull. So it's our shop window. It's not a very expensive way of advertising our products, and it's a lot of fun.
And all the effort, money and time that goes into organising these shows is a serious business.
It's a lot of work. As anybody who's ever organised a local show will tell you, it's a lot of telephoning, a lot of writing, a lot of problems, and very little thanks at the end of the day. The local shows tend to survive because they have very low overheads. There's probably an honorary secretary, there is no permanent staff to pay, and everybody mucks in together to have a good day. So they're always going to survive. The big shows are in more difficulties when farming is in more difficulties. The farmers don't attend the shows, the major machinery manufacturers perhaps don't attend, the sponsorships disappear, and they're left with the very high overheads of a permanent staff and expensive showground rates and rent and so on. But when things are good, the big shows fulfill a very good need in farming, both socially and business-wise, and we hope that they'll survive.
And long may that be so. Most people see nothing of the industry that feeds them, but local or national shows open up farming to us all through the industry's fascinating summer shop window.
Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Market reports.
Like any industry, farming needs constant information to keep up with its changes, conditions and circumstances, and it uses all forms of media to do so. Apart from radio, television and newspapers, there are 16 major farming magazines which circulate a total of nearly 750,000 copies every week. This information is vital to Alex Park.
Whether the farmer knows it or not, he's being constantly bombarded with information on his business, and he will glean from that just how the industry is going, whether the milk price is going up or down, beef is up or down, pig prices are up or down. And he takes notice of that, either consciously or even subconsciously, in making his decisions when to sell his stock, when to buy his commodities. We don't get a lot of coverage on television, just a couple of programs on a Sunday, but our most important program of the week is the weather forecast on a Sunday, which forecasts what we're going to get the following week. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not so right, but it's very important as the weather controls really our activities. Radio is very useful because it's immediate, it's up to date, and it comes out every morning. But I suppose that the communications we get most of are the free newspapers, which seem to arrive with amazing regularity every day.
And, like many other people in today's world, computer communication is playing a growing part in the farmer's world. Farmers aren't, after all, in the dark ages.
I think every farmer will have a computer of some sort in the next 10 years. And I know on our own farm we're linked up to Prestel, and we're able to make many decisions through the computer. We can buy all our requirements through the computer, and we can sell all our stock through the computer. I don't like to take it to that stage because we lose all the personal contact. I like to have the fertiliser rep in the office so that I can see by his responses to my questions whether the prices are going up, coming down, whether I should be buying now or hanging off for another week to see what happens. And we can also pick up lots of gossip, tidbits and so on. It's much more interesting to talk to somebody than just to use the computer.
Which just goes to show that human nature, or the importance of face-to-face contact, is something which even computers can't replace, down on the farm.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, imports and exports.
As the United Kingdom produces 2/3 of her own food, it might seem logical to assume that she merely needs to import the remaining third. Not so. Partly because of trade agreements and the fact that we produce surpluses of some foods and very small quantities of others, farming imports and exports are big business. For example, while we imported over £8,000 million worth of food and drink last year, we exported more than £4,000 million worth. What kinds of produce do we send abroad? Alex Park.
The most important exports would be grain, oilseeds, potatoes, the commodities. They are exported through very large export terminals dotted around the coast of Britain and go on to the world market at the world market prices. The processed products such as cheese, meat products, specialty meat products are a very interesting area for development. We now have an organisation called Food for Britain, which goes overseas, determines potential markets for British produce and does advertising locally, does demonstrations. They then come back to the British farmers and say there are demands in such and such a country for particular products. Produce good quality, plenty of it, and regular quality, very important, and try and match the two together. This is Food for Britain. Potentially it's a very effective organisation, but we as farmers have got to grow the quality of food year in, year out, week in, week out, and supply it to the customers.
And actually getting that food to the customer is a complicated business. One method is where grain groups up and down the country organise their own export facilities.
We've started a cooperative called Tyne Grain, which is based in Newcastle, and it's been operating for 2 years now. We've built a 25,000 tonne grain storage plant which can handle ships to 25,000 tonnes. So it's the biggest terminal in the country. The cooperative operates that we send grain from the field into the plant. It's dried, processed, cleaned, and so on, and standardised, so that we put it into large bins holding maybe 5,000 tonnes of grain of a specific quality. We can then go to the exporters and say we've got 5,000 tonnes of top quality milling wheat, and they know it's top quality. We can handle a ship of 5,000 or even 25,000 tonnes, and the ship comes in, we load it within a day, and it's on its way again.
Which is an example of regional initiative, marketing and shipping food from our own farms to compete with those huge ones in countries like America, Canada and Australia.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Farming incomes.
You probably believe that those who own and farm this country's land are fairly well off, but how much do our farmers earn? It's not an easy question to answer. There are set wages in the industry, but a farmer's income is determined by things like prices, land values and government support. How is this income arrived at? David Evans of the NFU.
Well, I suppose the big difference is that the worker with set wages knows each week or each month or each year how much he's going to get. The farmer is operating on a business basis. He has to pay certain costs each year. Then he has to see how much of the produce he actually achieves as a result of the weather and so on. He has to see what price he achieves for that produce on the marketplace where he sells it. And if he's lucky, at the end of the year, he's made a profit.
Like so many jobs in the United Kingdom, there are conflicting assumptions and the odd myth about farming incomes. So, how best should they be judged?
Well, really, how should anybody's income be judged? You judge their income by the contribution they're making to our national well-being. I believe that farmers are making a very big contribution to our national well-being, and I think they deserve to be reasonably well paid for it.
Of course, on paper, those who own farms appear to be wealthy through capital values, but the returns on that capital, on the land and buildings, crops, livestock and machinery, are about half what would be expected in other industries. So, is the farmer well off or not?
I expect some are, and there are quite a lot who aren't. I'd just say that over recent years, farm incomes certainly have tended to lag behind incomes in other sectors of the population.
And what about that myth that all farmers are rich? David Dent.
I don't know how we'll ever break this myth that all farmers are rich, because they are certainly not, and they certainly have no easy life. If you want an honest appraisal, I don't know why some of them do it. It's a way of life to them, and it always will be. Really, some people, most people would not put up with the hours, they'd not put up with the responsibility, and they certainly wouldn't put up with it for the money.
Which raises an interesting point about jobs like farming. There are many of them which cannot be measured in 9-to-5 terms, and equally, the rewards can be as variable as the work itself.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Capital expenditure.
Capital, or the money invested in farming, is an essential piece in the jigsaw. For individual farmers, the value of capital assets determines the amount of money he can borrow to invest in his business of food production and farm improvement. Land is his biggest asset. It represents 80% of all the capital tied up in the average farm. Livestock comes next at 10%, machinery at 6%, and crops at 2%. Why is land such a big percentage of his capital? David Evans.
Basically, you can't do the job of producing food unless you have land. It's true that with improved yields, it's possible to produce more food from less land nowadays, but nevertheless, land has got to be a basic part of agriculture. It's also true that there are some activities, such as, say, poultry production or pig production, where you can keep the animals separate from any particular quantity of land and feed them with bought-in feeding stuffs. But those feeding stuffs basically have to be produced from land.
All that capital tied up in land and buildings is called fixed capital, and the rest is working capital. The relation between the two depends on the many different types of farm in the United Kingdom. But on all of them, wherever they are, capital is invested in machinery, to the tune of over £700 million each year.
Well, farming is like any other industry. It's got to take advantage of the technology available, and farmers in this country have to compete with people elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Therefore, they've got to invest in the kind of equipment which enables them to do their job efficiently and to sell their produce as cheaply as possible.
All in all, the working capital needed for pig or poultry farming is about twice as high as that involved in dairying, which is twice as high in turn as arable farming. But to give a rough guide, an average 200-acre farm will have about £500,000 of capital tied up in it, and that's an awful lot of money to be responsible for.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Grants, subsidies and guarantees.
Grants and subsidies. No doubt at some time or another you'll have heard discussions on government and common market support for farming. It's a complicated business, but this support is aimed at two things: to keep the price of food within reasonable bounds, but also to help an industry with unique characteristics. And statistics show that it works. The increase in food prices for the European community's consumers is far less than many of our international competitors. There's another point too. If farmers only received what we pay for food, in most cases they couldn't afford to produce it. So what would happen to prices in shops and supermarkets if support was withdrawn? David Evans of the NFU.
Well, I believe that in the end they would go up. I think what would happen if you withdrew all subsidies and all support systems immediately, then there would be a period of great turmoil on food markets. I think that many people would decide it wasn't worthwhile going on producing food, and that would probably lead to shortages of supply later on.
And that's something that farmers and consumers can't grumble about. Supply is high, both get fair prices, and as a nation, we eat well. But support isn't just about price. There is help for the farmer in many aspects of his work, from drainage and building grants to support for hill farmers, with the Hill Livestock Compensatory Allowance, for instance.
These are being changed at present. For the past 15 years or so, there's been a system under which farmers have been able to get grant towards various kinds of capital expenditure. That has been allowed under common market rules, and those rules are now being changed in a way which directs the aid more towards the smaller farm, and in particular more towards environmental objectives.
And in farming circles, they are two big objectives: the protection of the small farmer, who is an important part of the United Kingdom's farming backbone, and a continued care for the environment in which all farmers work.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. What does the EEC do?
Since the United Kingdom joined the European Community in 1973, both farmer and consumer have been directly affected by the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. In many ways, the CAP is the cornerstone of Europe. That's because behind the tons of paperwork and complex legislation, it has some pretty clear objectives: to guarantee regular supplies of food, to stabilise markets and keep prices reasonably steady, and to give all farmers a fair deal. So how's it doing? David Evans of the NFU.
People in this country love to hate the Common Agricultural Policy, and I think that's a pity, because it in fact provides a pretty sound framework for agriculture to do its job for the nation. There are clearly some areas which need improvement, and one of the difficulties is that everything has to be negotiated in Brussels, and you can't always get the exact answer that you would want. One of the things that we have to do is to gear ourselves up to be able to export food to the continent and to compete with the very efficient and competitive continental food suppliers.
In fact, with 10 members, and Spain and Portugal too, it's not surprising that the CAP is a complicated business. Different currencies, different systems and member states who have different advantages and disadvantages for the EEC's major common policy to consider. So, from a farmer's point of view in the United Kingdom, is the CAP successful?
I think it's been reasonably successful, but the difficulty is that some of the arrangements were designed for the continental farmer and for the continental system of food distribution rather than for our own type of arrangements. And we've had some difficulty coming to terms with that, but on the whole it's been reasonably successful.
And the way forward should be as bold as the setting up of the CAP in the first place. Its rationalisation for the 1980s and the 21st century, a growing place in world markets, and reduced public cost, all for the benefit of two groups of people, consumers and farmers, to give the best of both worlds in fair returns and moderate prices.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, the unseen costs of farming.
Looking at farming from the outside, we see only the obvious costs. A cow in a field, for instance. It obviously costs money to buy or raise, but surely the grass grows free to make the milk we pay for, right? Wrong. Everything costs down on the farm because of raw materials, the labour involved and the energy required. And farming has many hidden costs like these. David Evans.
I think a lot of people look over the hedge and think, oh, that looks nice, without realising just how much work has gone into keeping the countryside of this country in the state that it's in. I think, for example, there's drainage. I mean, drainage is something you don't know about because it's under the ground. You don't see it. But draining fields and keeping fields well drained is a very important part of farming and a very expensive activity.
Take electricity in chickens. What with the lighting and heating required to keep them in the right condition, a poultry farmer will use up to 25 units of electricity per day for 100 chickens. Or take an acre of wheat. The cost for that includes seed, fertiliser, pesticides, ploughing, harrowing, drilling, harvesting and grain drying. So can we say what a farmer gets from an acre of wheat?
Oh, I can't possibly generalise on that. There is just no average figure that you can give. It depends how much wheat the farm actually can get from that particular acre of land, which depends on the quality of land. It also depends on the costs that the farmer has incurred in producing it, how much fertiliser he's used, how expensive it is to actually plough that land and so on. I'm sorry, there's no simple answer to that question.
Looked at from another point of view, that of the small hill farmer, a shopping list of outgoings to keep his farm running in a typical year is certainly different. David Dent.
If I say, oh, this hill farmer gets 20,000 a year, everybody says, bah, that's a lot of money. Out of that 20,000, he feeds all his stock, he buys all his diesel, he replaces his equipment, he buys his own replacements for his stock, he pays his rent, he pays all his maintenance, and he feeds his wife and children.
So, whether it's wheat or chickens, dairying or horticulture, there's more to the cost of farming and food production that meets the eye.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Farming by Microelectronics.
Microelectronics in farming? Well, yes. Just as they're changing methods in every other sphere of industry, so they are in the countryside. The computer is finding its place down on the farm. For one thing, computers now take much of the burden of paperwork out of farming, keeping track of stocks, bills, plans and performances. And they are also helping the business part of farming itself. So what is the place of microelectronics on the farm? Don McRae.
Well, they're involved in, I would say, 4 areas of agricultural management. That is in planning the farm business, in helping to execute those plans, recording the information and then analysing that information so that better decisions can be made in the future. By far the most important area of application of microelectronics will be the recording of information and the subsequent analysis of that.
These microelectronics are at work in farming practice too. The latest potato harvester, for instance, scans potatoes electronically and sorts them into grades. In milking, cows may now wear magnetised collars that signal to computerised feeding units exactly how much food and of what type each cow should have. And in pig and poultry raising, computerized automation does the feeding, the weighing, and even the egg collecting. So what of the future of computerized farming?
There's been a continuing interest in the automated collection of information about agriculture, such as the milk temperature, the temperature of cows, the body temperature, and weather information, which might help farmers apply the inputs to the crops and to the animals in a more precise manner. The problem for the future is, how do we interpret all this information and make sense of it in such a way that we can make better decisions on the farm and gain higher yields of both animal products and crops. So the emphasis in the future will be on computer programs which will show a certain degree of intelligence, which will be able to interpret this information in an intelligent manner and make specific recommendations.
All to improve our food production processes. In fact, microelectronics on the farm could be one of the most fertile growth areas. High technology and nature working together.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, mechanical inventions,
from the first wooden plough to the latest combine harvester, farm machinery has evolved and developed over the centuries to help improve efficiency. Today, every aspect of farming involves its own sophisticated specialist equipment. Even the plough, with its scientifically designed reversible blades, shows the hallmarks of modern technology. All the way along the line, from seed drills to fertilizer spreaders, machinery saves time and costs and cuts out some of the drudgery of food production. What does Don McRae think?
On almost every farm in the UK, you'll find evidence of machines being used to take out the back-breaking labour element of farm work. For example, many dairy herds are converting to what's called automatic cluster removals devices, which remove the actual milking machine from the cow. Materials handling, such as fertilisers and seed, are gradually moving on to a bulk basis, whereby the lifting of heavy bags is no longer necessary.
There are ditch digging machines too, and machines that can lay drains underground, or those that create huge round bales of hay and straw. In potato fields, sensitive new harvesters now lift and sort the crop as carefully as the old teams of stooping pickers, and taking out the soil and stones with electronic scanners. Machines do so much work on the farm, but how reliable are they?
Obviously, with any new development, there can be teething problems. But on the whole, the machinery in use on farms is quite reliable. There are stories, for example, of automatic dispensing machines for concentrate feeds, which, when supplied with the wrong type of concentrate, which has too much, for example, fat in it, it can sort of cake up the system. And this can lead to a situation when you have a 20-ton bin which has to be manually emptied, which is no fun.
Expensive though farm machinery is today, it saves enormously on costs, which in turn keeps food at affordable prices. We may look back from the tractor to the great Shire horses with regret, but down on the farm, it's machinery that literally keeps the wheels turning.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, seed strains,
Strange though it may sound, plant breeding plays a vital part in farming progress. New seeds are constantly being developed to improve productivity or to suit crops more specifically to certain types of ground, by cross-fertilizing different strains to combine their best characteristics. How does it work? Don McRae.
The first step is to identify exactly what characteristics of a certain variety or species are desirable from the agricultural industry point of view. For example, in barley, which is used for malting, which goes on to make beer, the requirement is for a high degree of starch, i.e. sugar, which will eventually go on to be converted to alcohol. The secret is to identify that characteristic and isolate the species and try and get it into a high-yielding modern variety which can then be grown on a wide scale in the UK.
It's similar to livestock breeding, but with the added difficulty sometimes of sterility or incompatibility, and with the important difference that most crop plants are asexual. They can fertilise themselves. How successful is plant breeding then?
Over the past 30 years, say from 1950 onwards, the yield of wheat grown in the UK has increased from 2.6 tonnes per hectare, that's every 2.5 acres, in 1950 to more than twice that, that's 5.76 in 1981. And scientists have attributed at least half of this increase to progress in plant breeding.
Impressive statistics, but how long does it take to create these new strains, and what does it all lead to? Farmer Alex Park.
It's a very quick job, a relatively quick job to breed new varieties of cereals. We're getting better resistance to virus and fungal disease. We're getting stronger straw to keep the crop upright when the wind and rain tends to put it down. And we're getting early ripening, and that's very important in Britain.
So plant breeding is creating great benefits in the production of food. In effect, the developing science of seed strains.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Pest control.
Everybody has heard of foot and mouth and its disastrous effects, but it's only one of many diseases and pests that plague the British farmer and attack his animals and crops. Viruses, bacteria, fungi, pests like insects, flies, intestinal parasites, and even rabbits. Uncontrolled, they can reduce or even ruin a farmer's productivity. They can be combated in two ways, indirectly or directly. Indirectly, they can be controlled by careful land use, or by the use of seed and stock resistant to these diseases and pests. Don McRae.
The first and most important method is to try to capitalise on some natural property. For example, by choosing a variety of a crop which has a specific natural resistance to a pest or disease. The other method is by selective and careful application of modern pesticides which control the pest, be it a fungal disease or an insect.
And that's called direct control, sprayed onto crops or land and administered to animals through spraying, dipping, drenching or inoculation. There have been some notable success stories, like the near eradication of the warble fly which plagues livestock. But can we honestly say that we're winning the battle?
Farming has scored some major successes against the diseases and pests, but these will always exist. And of course it's a battle between how fast they can adapt to the sort of controls that we bring in and how fast we can adjust and bring in new products. But on the whole, we have been making good progress against diseases and pests in the UK.
Direct treatment controls pests and diseases, but it will be a long time, if ever, before they are eliminated. Disease and pest control has also become a major cost factor. Successful direct controls are being developed, but they need to be as cost-effective as conventional methods before they'll be adopted.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Fertilisers.
Fertilisation is an essential part of farming because it replaces in the soil the four vital elements of calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium that make things grow. Traditionally, organic fertiliser has been used to feed the soil, but today's high productivity requires help from other sources. Productive soil is alive with the beneficial bacteria that convert organic matter into food for crops and grass, and the more you feed the soil, the more productive it becomes. Don McRae.
I think the best analogy is to think of the crop as, for example, a motor car, and as the fertiliser as the fuel that makes it go. All crops need vital elements such as nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, and these are obviously already in the soil, but over the years we have selected for crops which will respond to generous treatment of fertilizers, especially nitrogen. Nitrogen can be regarded as the fuel or the booster which allows us to grow these high yields and increase the wheat yields as we've just seen.
With artificial fertilizers, those elements can be fed into the soil in the exact proportions needed for both soil and crop type. Apart from nitrogen causing growth, potassium ensures healthy plants, and phosphorus is good for the roots. They're all so essential for successful food production.
It's very important that farmers, when they do grow high-yielding crops, realize that they are taking natural elements out of the soil, and it's very critical to put these back in, as it were. And of course, as yields go up, as we've seen, then the offtake of these minerals increases. So it is important that we at least put back on what we've taken off. Thereby we will keep the soil in good order and pass it on to the next generation in a fertile condition.
So farmers fertilize their land as much as the land needs to provide its optimum yield. And research shows that this process is actually helping to improve the very structure of soil itself, and thus increase our food production capacity.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. The balance of nature.
Man's relationship with nature is currently one of the most important problems facing most countries of the world. How we shape and affect our environment through our work and lives. But specifically, since our farmer's success depends on his ability to control natural resources, many people believe that he is the one who holds the scales on which the balance of nature is weighed, in ensuring that our countryside is preserved and enhanced. David Evans.
Well, clearly, because farmers are the people who have the responsibility for working in and looking after our countryside, they have a very important part to play in holding the scales, as you'd call it, of the balance of nature. I think that many farmers are very much aware of the responsibility which they have in that respect.
Our society is constantly changing. A growing population makes increasing demands on the land, and farming seeks new ways to increase productivity in order to feed the nation. But a concern for nature is uppermost in the mind of farmer Alex Park.
Nature is vital because we are the custodians of the countryside, and we use nature and amend it to make our living. We have crops which we standardise, we breed, we look after, which provide the food for this country and the living for the farmers. We've got to be very careful that we don't lose what we've built up. And I think maybe through the 70s we weren't as good conservationists as we might have been. And we now realise that harm has been done and we must correct it.
There's been much discussion in recent years on the amount of decreasing woodland and hedgerows in the United Kingdom. What is the industry's view on this?
We think that the countryside in the end is man-made. It's become the way it is because of the way in which it's been farmed over many centuries. And in other words, it's a result of the technology which has been available in agriculture. In fact, there are many areas where woodlands are reappearing. The trouble is that when you plant trees, they're so small that people can't see them. I think in 20 years' time or so, many people will realise that there is a lot of attractive woodland on British farms. I think people will also start to find now that hedgerows are, in fact, being well kept and are tending to reappear in some areas.
It's evident that our farmers are generally the guardians of the land, and while some are irresponsible, the majority care deeply about it, now and for the future, endeavouring to balance productivity with conservation, and above all, to understand the land they work.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Using the countryside.
A day out in the country makes a pleasant change for those of us who live in towns and cities. To most people, a source of recreation. But to the farmer, it's his livelihood, and sometimes the two views clash. But should multi-use of the countryside be a source of conflict? David Evans.
I think one of the important things about the countryside in this country is that we both use it for recreation and for economic activities such as farming and forestry. So obviously there's something of a conflict between those two. But I think with reasonable awareness on both sides of the needs of other people, then it doesn't have to be a conflict. I'm sure that farmers are very much aware of the need for the countryside to be kept in good order for the enjoyment of people generally.
Of course, our countryside is protected by law. Places designated as areas of outstanding beauty or scientific interest and the national parks preserve our natural heritage. And the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Acts gives recourse against minority farmers insensitive enough to interfere in those special places. On the other hand, the majority seek to maintain good practices.
I think there are a number of these. I think one of the best examples is the membership by farmers of farming and wildlife advisory groups, which are dedicated to improving the countryside and to maintaining wildlife. I think many farmers in recent years have been planting trees or replanting hedgerows in many cases. The benefits of these aren't entirely apparent yet because the trees are still sometimes quite small. I think generally farmers keep the countryside tidy and well cared for, and they often maintain traditional buildings and traditional hedgerows and so on.
For instance, on Alex Park's North Country Farm, nature is positively encouraged.
On our own farm, we spend a lot of time planting trees, copses and so on, and then leaving it to the natural habitation so that the animals can get into it, insects, birds, and the natural vegetation can take place. We use bigger tackle on the farms now, so we're not able to go into corners of fields as we used to do. So we leave these corners now, and the natural habitation again can take over. I think if we try to plough every acre of land in this country and every square inch, we would be doing the country a tremendous disservice.
So, on the whole, there is a fair and reasonable compromise. Farmers respect the public right of access to the land, and the public respects the farmer's property, for the countryside to exist as a place of work and a source of pleasure.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Disappearing farmland.
Disappearing farmland? It sounds like a bad thriller, but it's a serious fact that every year over 100,000 acres of farmland are lost forever. This loss has been consistent since the mid-60s, depriving us of nearly 2% of the total land area annually. And it's evenly spread throughout the 5 official grades of land, from the prime Grade 1 arable to the roughest Grade 5 moorland. We lose it to spreading towns and cities, to industry, to recreation, and to forestry. We lose some to mining and some to new reservoirs. To what extent are these losses increasing? David Evans.
Well, it's not so much a problem of its increasing every year, but it is certainly continuing every year. And each year in this country we lose to agriculture quite a sizable area of land. You could say it's about the size of the Isle of Wight, which we lose every year. And you can see in that sense that it is depleting our agricultural base. And that is something which in the long term is going to damage our ability to feed ourselves as a country.
Urban spread tends to take the better land, Grade 1 or 2, because towns and cities are situated largely on the flat lowlands, either on a river plain or a coastal area, where the land will be most productive. Mining also claims such land. Forestry and water supply tend to take the less productive areas. Yet although the overall area of farmland shrinks, productivity goes on rising. Does this compensate for land loss?
Yes, broadly speaking, it does, and this is one way in which the problem of land loss is somewhat eased. In recent years, we've seen major technological improvement in agriculture, and in particular, we've seen in certain crops particularly, the introduction of new genetic material, which has meant that we've got improved yields. And that has meant that the land loss in a global sense has been recompensed in the supply of food. But of course, it hasn't overcome the problem for the individual farmer or for the individual area where land has been lost to agriculture.
So it's worth considering why. We lose farmland because it is needed for other uses, and that's because a rising population requires more houses, more water, more roads. But the population increase is slowing down, and land loss appears to be following suit. Thankfully for the future, and for the fact that over 80% of our total land area is still devoted to farming.
Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. Derelict land.
When we talk about derelict land in this country, it conjures up images of spoil heaps, rubbish dumps, and old industrial sites strewn with the debris of bygone productivity. But vast areas of the world suffer from natural wastage, where the climate, the geology, or combinations of natural conditions conspire to prevent any productive use of the land. Here in the United Kingdom, any wastage is man-made. We've a good growing climate, efficient farming practices, and a large hungry population. Consequently, less than 1% of our total land area is derelict or wasted. Which bits do they include? David Evans.
I think there are quite a number of examples of this. One kind of example would be where you have rather badly drained land which can't be farmed to its optimum level of productivity. Another very good example is land on the urban fringes, farmland around the major conurbations or towns which has become damaged or depleted because of the fact that it's on the edge of the town. It may be that the crops are damaged by smoke. It may be that people are tending to use the fields to throw their rubbish into. It may be that the hedgerows are damaged by vandalism and so on. And this is a very major problem for farming in quite a large acreage.
We aren't quite at the top of the World League for efficiency in the use of our land. Denmark holds that distinction, but we're close. Even the least productive areas have some use. The roughest moorland can be used to support sheep, whilst the worst land can be drained, fertilised and improved to increase its productivity. We can also reclaim land in order that it supports farming.
I think the best examples of land reclamation, and some of the good ones are very good indeed, are where open cast mineral workings, either of coal or iron ore, sometimes of gravel, have been restored to agriculture. They've often been restored in a very effective way so that they make productive land. And of course, when you're restoring land of that kind, if it's well done, it can be done in a way which is beautiful to look at as well.
In terms of statistics, 80% of our total land surface in Britain produces food. 19% carries our houses, our industry, roads, reservoirs, airports and sports grounds. And just 1% carries old tin cans and abandoned cars, the stigma of dereliction. It seems certain that increasing care in the use of our most precious resource will see to it that even this 1% will dwindle in the near future. As they say, if you waste not, you want not.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today, production and the EEC.
Behind all its complexities, the European Community's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, is just what it says, a common or joint farming policy for all member states, which currently spends almost 70% of the EEC's budget. Small wonder then that the CAP generates so much media interest, especially with reports of overproduction. The so-called mountains and lakes, where farm produce has to be stored and eventually disposed of because there isn't an immediate market for it. To be fair, the sizes of these surpluses are often exaggerated, but they do exist. How serious a problem are they? David Evans of the NFU.
I think it's quite clear that for milk and for cereals and perhaps increasingly for beef over the coming years, there is a serious problem. It's a problem of cost. From the consumer's point of view, I think it's really quite an encouraging thing to know that we've got a bit too much food. I think it's much better to have a bit too much food than to have not enough. But the problem is the cost of actually maintaining and disposing of these surpluses, and that's the main issue in farm policy discussion at present.
Which highlights a point about all EEC policies, and the CAP in particular. Though it takes time to change things, member states don't just sit around and do nothing. Discussion, debate, negotiation, all are involved in trying to get the CAP right. Coping with the complex problem of surpluses is one example. Are there any ways round this overproduction?
Well, there are various ways that you can deal with the surplus situation. The main problem from the British farmer's point of view is perhaps that he's been too successful. The surplus problem is a problem of too much success. We're managing to produce too much food. You can deal with surpluses by holding back prices or by introducing quotas, or by having special export arrangements and so on. The technique, I think, depends on the individual commodity. What's suitable for milk will not necessarily be suitable for cereals. It's a major problem. It's one which doesn't only confront Europe, and I think it is one of the things that agriculturists throughout the world have got to think very hard about in the coming few years.
Which does raise an important issue, that surplus agricultural production in Europe cannot be solved by transferring surpluses to the needy parts of the world as food aid. Ultimately, the food requirements of less developed countries can only be tackled by investment and improved food production methods, a policy of helping others to help themselves.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. The Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food.
Right in the heart of London's Whitehall, you'll find the government ministry responsible for all our food-producing resources, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. It has 36 separate divisions dealing with everything from sheep to sugar, milk to management, and separate departments for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, all for administering British farming. The Right Honourable Michael Jopling, Minister for Agriculture, is himself a farmer from North Yorkshire, but up there in Whitehall, how much can he really know about the situation down on the farm?
I think this minister knows quite a lot because I was trained in agriculture at the university. I farm myself. I've been on the council of the Farmers Union. Of course, I'm a member of Parliament, and I go to my constituency very frequently, and I talk all the time to farmers. I go to the House of Commons, where, of course, there are a lot of other MPs who spend their weekends talking to their farmers. And so one does get a great deal of material fed back. Also, I head a department here which employs 11,000 people. Practically half of them are in our National Advisory Service. They're continually in touch with farmers, and so there is a constant feedback that way. I'm in touch with the farmers' unions and with all the other organisations who represent the agricultural industry. And so I think that all the information does come back to me and to my department, and I think we know very well what's going on.
And the ministry has a really key function to meet the widely differing needs within the entire farming industry, sometimes a tough task.
This is what the Common Agricultural Policy is about. That's one of the things this department has to do, because we take each individual commodity, whether it be milk or whether it be wheat, and we look at them all separately, and we make individual assessments, and we make policies to judge the problems of each sector. And so I think we do look at the various difficulties which arise so far as big and small farmers are concerned. They all really have the same problems, and I don't think that that is a matter which causes us too much difficulty.
The ministry has very wide powers to create and implement policy, to set standards in food quality, even in labelling and advertising, along with wide responsibilities for farming now and in the future. But its main responsibility is to give our farmers the conditions in which they can put the largest amounts of good quality food as possible into our shops.
The Farmer's World, a series which explains farming today. The marketing boards.
Getting food from the fields to our front doors is a process controlled to varying degrees by organisations known as the marketing boards. One of those is the Milk Marketing Board, or MMB, started after Lord Addison's Agricultural Marketing Act in the 1930s, at a time when recession in agriculture was bankrupting many milk producers. The situation's different today, but what exactly does the Milk Marketing Board do? Steve Roberts of the MMB.
Well, the Milk Marketing Board was set up in 1933, and it really brings together all producers who have to sell their milk to the board. It is able to regulate the quality of that milk coming to the board. It is able to regulate the flow through to the priority customers in the country, whether it be liquid milk or manufacturing milk, or whether it be butter, whether it be cheese, in order to meet the needs of the people. It is also, because it controls the raw material, able to make sure that we get the best supply of milk anywhere in the world in this country.
But how does that work in practice for our doorstep pinters? Well, the MMB collects milk from farms and delivers it to local dairies. Milk tanker haulage firms, like Derelict, have set routes round farms every day, which means there's a lot of milk on the move every day. Each tanker carries 9,000 litres. Once at the dairies, the milk is either processed for liquid consumption, our daily pinters, or is used for products like butter and cheese. However, fitting this network into the EEC can create MMB problems.
The main problems of the MMB are at present making it fit into Europe, which has a very different milk structure to what we have in this country. Europe has a structure been built up for many generations on exports, and because it is built up on exports, it has done it through cooperatives. We in this country have a milk industry that is based on home consumption. See, we still only provide about 85% of what we need, and that is through private enterprise and through multinational companies and the board itself, which controls about 25% of the milk.
And what about quality in our pinters, an area for which the MMB is responsible? Tanker drivers take weekly samples from farms, which are analysed at dairies, and the farmers get incentives for top quality milk. The service is fast too. Milk collected on Monday mornings will be sitting on your doorstep 24 hours later.